Hello and welcome to Freedom Watch, your daily dose of raw liberty, streaming online at foxnews.com. I'm your host, Judge Andrew Napolitano, here defending freedom, defending your natural rights, and defending your right to have a government that stays within the confines of the Constitution. The whole purpose of the Second Amendment is to assure that no government can interfere with an individual's natural right to self-defense, self-defense against criminals and thugs, and self-defense against foreign enemies and domestic tyrants. I have defended this truism publicly for over 30 years in books, lectures, op-eds, and broadcasts. Today, when I remind audiences that the right is a natural one and it encompasses the moral authority to shoot a gun at the government when it has been taken over by tyrants, the audiences respond wildly, more so than I have ever seen in any public speech I have given or observed. The mood of the country has changed dramatically in 2009, and it is decidedly moving toward the framers' view of the Constitution. Here to discuss two very important Second Amendment cases that are now before the Supreme Court is James Bovard, policy advisor to the Future of Freedom Foundation. James, welcome back to Freedom Watch.
Hey, Judge. Thanks for having me on.
Were you surprised that two federal appeals courts reading the same Heller versus District of Columbia case that you and I read and have read and have talked about somehow interpreted it as applying the right to self-defense only is immune from federal interference and not from state interference?
Well, it's hard to underestimate the idiocy of a lot of these federal judges. And maybe some of these folks have the same trouble that congressmen have, that they don't read so good. It's shocking to me that the Heller decision would not be taken self-evidently as striking down a lot of the local and state firearm prohibitions across the country, because there's a lot of places in Illinois and elsewhere that have got laws against citizens owning guns in their own homes that are so far over the top that they should never have passed a laugh test at any level of government. And yet it's bizarre. We have to do another round of Supreme Court decisions to find out what the Heller decision meant, that it actually says that it meant. So,
I think the Supreme Court is angry. I think it's angry that the District of Columbia is not moving fast enough to let people buy guns, the direct defendant in the Heller case. I think it's angry that federal judges in Chicago and New York City have basically said, oh, the city of Chicago can impose all the obstacles it wants to guns, and the state attorney general of the state of New York can do the same. Because I think the language in the Heller case and the history of the Second Amendment makes it abundantly clear that the right to self-defense, using whatever technology is available when you have to defend yourself, is crystal clear, is a natural right, is as natural to us as the right to think as you want and say what you think and publish what you say.
Yeah, I think you're right. I agree. As far as the D.C. case, it was so obvious that the D.C. government was showing maximum bad faith to the citizens of the district as far as blocking them from being able to purchase a gun to defend themselves in their own homes. A lot of the top politicians and officials were brazen about how they were going to put all these hurdles in the way of the Supreme Court's ruling. And this is very similar to what some of the southern states did after the Brown versus Board of Education case. And it's sad to see the same thing being used against people of all races and groups as far as their ability to own the right of self-defense. But it's, so many of these politicians think that they have the right to dictate how people can live and die, even in their own homes. And the arrogance, especially in a place like Washington, D.C., which has some of the highest crime rates and some of the worst police in the entire country, is bizarre.
It is bizarre, and unfortunately that big government attitude has infested the judiciary as well. And one of the judges on one of those two federal appeals court cases that held that the states can interfere with your right to defend yourself is now on the Supreme Court of the United States. Indeed, then Judge Sonia Sotomayor is one of the judges who said the Second Amendment doesn't stop the states or the towns and cities from interfering with your right to defend yourself. I wonder if she will take herself off the case, recuse herself, as we lawyers like to say, when the Supreme Court hears it.
Well, I don't think I'd bet the rent money on that. I mean, I think she was chosen in part because of opinions like that. I mean, I think that the new administration wants liberal judges, and at this point in time, liberals tend to be opposed to the right of self-defense, even in people's own homes. So
I'll tell you one thing she was right about. When she kiddingly told an audience at Duke University years ago, and we all watched this played over and over and over again on the news during the time of her confirmation hearings, that the federal appellate courts are where policy is made, she was right, and she did know that the Supreme Court has a limited amount of time and resources to hear appeals from all federal appellate courts. And if she and her big government friends could get away with blocking something like the right to keep and bear arms while federal appellate judges, they would do so.
yeah, and this is how it has evolved over the last 30 or 40 years. There are so many laws, there are so many court decisions, almost nobody's able to keep track, and this is turned into a ticket for tyranny.
Where does this go? I see the Supreme Court is coming down with a new decision basically saying, we told you that this is a fundamental right, so you can't interfere with it. You can keep guns away from crazies, but you can't put an obstacle in the path of a law-abiding adult to protect her or himself in their home.
Yeah, I think you're right about that, and I think it's because otherwise the Supreme Court would have to rule, flip over from last year's ruling and basically say that the Second Amendment doesn't really count for hardly anything except for, folks out in Wyoming to go deer hunting. And I don't think that they'd flip that far back. So, but it's really hard to trust the Supreme Court for anything because it's way too close to a crapshoot for comfort.
Just looking at the practical side of this, our mutual friend and colleague John Lott has written a great book called More Guns Equals Less Crime. That is statistically a given and can't even be challenged. In the parts of the country where people are allowed to keep and bear arms, there is far less crime than in the parts of the country where people are not permitted by local and state laws to do so. When will the big government types ever recognize that?
I don't know if it's a question of them having to recognize it, because as long as they have the power, as long as they have can dominate certain parts of the media and have sway over certain court decisions, they don't have to recognize it, because it's it's very rare for those kind of folks to be living in a very bad neighborhood where owning a .38 special is a life or death thing for you. These are folks who live in nice neighborhoods, and it's very abstract to them, whereas the folks living in rough neighborhoods or rough parts of the country who know that dialing 911 is, an exercise in futility often, these are folks who understand their rights a lot better than some of the rich folks who don't care.
James Bovard, thanks for joining us on Freedom Watch.
Thanks for having me on.